Welcome to the Jonathan and Barbara Silver Foundation. My name's Michael Brenson. I'm the Artistic Director of the Foundation, and it is April 22nd at 2 o'clock, and we're here for a very special occasion, which is a conversation with Alex Jones. Alex is the recipient of the Foundation's first grant. It was a grant for writing on sculpture. And one of the stipulations in the guidelines was that, or is, that after the year of the grant and after the writing project has been completed, or at least there is a substantial draft, that the writer and I will get together and we will talk and it will be recorded. And one of the purposes of the conversation is to be able to give feedback immediately to the person who did the writing. And the other purpose is to begin to make available to people who are interested in the foundation the substance of the writing and what it's about and the issues. So Alex's paper, it's a long form essay. It's an essay. It's called The Invisible River, Lauren Bond and the Aesthetics of Regeneration. And the grant gave Alex a chance to study a project that was clearly of great interest to her, Bending the River, and an artist, thinker, Lauren Bond, who's also clearly of interest to her and interest to all of us. And her larger project, the Metabolic Studio. So Alex was able to go out and she was able to visit her and then spend the time writing and spend the time deliberating not just on issues of ecological art and regeneration and its practices, but also to begin to theorize what this art might be and speculate on it and put together terms and the language that it needs, because a lot of this art is somewhat invisible, which is an important aspect of it that we'll talk about. It's an eloquent paper. I think it's in part quite beautifully written. It's a paper that stays away from rhetorics, conventions, jargons of the field, so that the language has a certain vitality that's very much Alex's own. And I'm really excited you're here, and I'm really excited to talk about this project with you, which I think is phenomenally interesting on many levels, interesting to me personally, and I'm sure it'll be interesting to many other people out there who will watch this video. So first of all, welcome. And second of all, I think we really need to begin by talking about Bending the River and the Metabolic Studio and get an idea what this complex project is.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's lovely to be here. And this is such a unique element of a writing project, to record a conversation and share this kind of process of development. So I'm looking forward to talking. As a sort of even background, there is a lot to unpack in terms of what is Bending the River. It's a big project, and hence my rather long essay about it. It's practically a book. But it comes out of this kind of very specific beat that I've been on for the past 5 years as an art writer, investigating intersections between contemporary art and ecology. I'm really interested in how ecology, as perhaps a field or a movement within the life sciences, is metabolized and made into a broader kind of cultural movement by the work of artists, or at least how we observe that largely through the work of artists. And so I've written a lot of shorter pieces over the past 5 or 6 years exploring facets of that topic. And I was really drawn to this opportunity of this particular grant for writing on sculpture because I felt like I had a really interesting case to dive deeper and do a longer form, kind of more big picture essay from what I've learned and been thinking about around, how do we write criticism about ecological art? What does it mean for artwork to be ecological? And this case study is Lauren Bond's Bending the River, which again is a complex project to unpack quickly because it's a very multimedia work that has been unfolding over several decades through the work of the Los Angeles-based artist Lauren Bond and in collaboration with her interdisciplinary atelier metabolic studio. And in simple terms, I guess, Bending the River is an environmental intervention in the structure of the Los Angeles River, which, for anyone not familiar with Los Angeles, the river that runs through that city is almost entirely paved. It was engineered as a flood control channel in the mid-20th century to prevent the city from being destroyed once again by the kind of catastrophic winter flooding that it's prone to. And this structure is, it represents the kind of ecological complexities that are innate to life in Los Angeles, but not unique there, because we all kind of live with engineered waterways that create paradoxical ecological problems. LA is a city that is prone to chronic drought, and like any storm drain should, this river infrastructure just pushes all the water right out of the city, and along with it, all the pollution. So not only is the city wasting its water, but it is basically exporting all of the pollution that the city generates to be someone else's problem. And this is the context into which Lauren Bond enters as an artist who really uniquely kind of combines activism and interdisciplinary inquiry and sculptural form into ambitious site-specific projects. And she wanted to create an intervention in this system. The full title of the work is sometimes Bending the River Back into the City, to take part of that water and keep it in the system and show how that can work better and how that can create a more ecologically sound system. And so she spent about 20 years amassing the permits and the resources and the expertise to create a small diversion of the river's flow. So the form of the work at this point is essentially a well where a small amount of the river water is collected. And already you can see, I'm sure, many complexities in what the artwork is here. One of them being that what's going to happen to that water now that it's being collected is sort of an open-ended conversation, and one that is uncertain and requires continuing to navigate legal complexities as well as creative questions. So I really entered into this project with this question for myself and for the text, like, what is this work of art? As you mentioned, much of which is physically invisible. It's buried underneath the concrete of the city.
And how is the water collected? What is the form in the river that she's managed to collect it? How is it collected, and what does she do with it?
Well, it's coming, all you can really see at this point is a small kind of intake grate in the low flow channel of the kind of half pipe of the river. And beneath that is vitrified clay pipe that has been installed that leads to a well, a very deep cistern on Lauren Bond's metabolic studio property. So we're taking water from this federal property, flowing through the federal flood control zone, and piping a small amount onto the private property of the artist's studio. And
that cistern was there.
She built it.
Uh-huh.
So they call that aspect of the work the mother well, because it is, kind of the heart of the projects, of the sculptural anatomy of the work. Lauren has made other sculptural works that very much deal with imagery of the heart, but also because this is the mother in the sense that whatever comes next is going to come out of this well. In order to get the right to take this water, it's very conditional use. It must be used in a very specific way for very specific purposes, which is part of the limitation of the process that the artist needs to navigate creatively. And I don't want to get too in the weeds just yet, actually, about like what's going to happen to the water. It's a bit of a open-ended question. Part of why I've, not brought this text entirely to its final public form, because the work of art is something that is very much in the process of being made now. And I found it very interesting to, instead of like we so often do as art critics, where we're evaluating something that's been declared as finished, whether that's an exhibition review or a catalog text or, whatever. It's very interesting and relevant to the topic of ecological art to me to enter into a work that is not yet completed and, in fact, may never really be completed.
So, can you describe a little bit what the cistern is like, and the size of it, and how she built it?
Well, the project required construction crews and engineers, and it's a very large scale. I don't know exactly off the top of my head how deep the well is, but you basically you can't see the bottom. It's several hundred feet deep, and very large infrastructure that required much more than an artist's studio to create. So again, there's also a uniqueness to this work in terms of the material scale at which it's operating, and one which requires a lot of collaboration from designers and engineers,
hydrologists.
Yes, yeah, as well as bureaucrats and city officials and people that allowed this to happen, because this is actually the first time that any individual has been granted the right to make such an intervention, to take water from the LA River in 100 years. So
this was all built underground, the cistern?
It's basically all underground, yeah.
And how does it work with the actual water? And I know there was a kind of transformation or revelation almost when what happened to the water underneath the concrete, and is that where suddenly concrete was pulled off, and then this crystal clear water underneath the river suddenly appeared, and is that water that wound up then in the cistern, like underneath her studio? Can you? I'm just trying to get as precise an image I can.
Sure. The water that is being drawn is actually from above ground. It's the water that's basically flowing in the storm control drain. So this is the water that is coming runoff from the city, as well as whatever's flowing down, the river from upstream, which is much of the year very little water. A lot of times this river looks empty. And that is the water that is getting diverted. And the kind of moment of revelation you're referring to gets at kind of the heart of what the water is already doing, right? Again, I'll put a pin in like what is the artist planning to do with the water that's in the mother well, because it's very much a work in progress. But the water has already done some very profound kind of phenomenological work. This essay is, as you mentioned, it's rather narrative, and a lot of it is in the first person, which is important to me in terms of my practice writing about this kind of work, to let it be this this phenomenological approach of like wanting to experience the work with a kind of storytelling sensibility, as well as coming to the work with a kind of openness to what that story is going to become. And that is also very innate to the project itself, in terms of Lauren's experience of making this invisible infrastructure, which I learned about in visiting her, which is that when they did this primary construction in 2023, and I went down.
Primary, that's when the mother well was built.
Yeah, quite recently, in the scope of something so large and ambitious. And I went down into the river channel with Lauren, and she showed me, what you can see of the intake grate in the river and the kind of scars on the concrete river jacket where they pulled up the concrete to put down this clay pipe underground.
And when you say that was the city that did that, or was that
it was a private construction crew?
So it was done for her project. Okay.
Yeah. The city is heavily involved in terms of the permissions behind it. But this was, it's a very rare occasion that there's concrete being pulled up. It's very emblematic of the river, that it has been paved over, and which makes a lot of the discourse around the river and a lot of the way people talk about it in Los Angeles is as a dead river, as a kind of ghost river, as something that's been paved over and destroyed.
And the water itself is being dead because of the pollution, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically treated urban runoff, most of that water, and so, yes, it is quite polluted, and most stretches of the river look, devoid of biodiversity. It does not look like a river, I grew up on a trout fishing river in the Southeast, and it doesn't look anything like that. But
so is the river then, in terms of LA, is it almost thought of as a kind of stain, rather than a living entity within the city that, maybe even like the Hudson or East River here, where there are waterways that the city is proud of and depends on, that the river that flows through LA is some other kind of thing, and it's not thought of so much even in terms of life.
Absolutely. And that's related to art and aesthetics too, right? Because it is perceived as being ugly and brutalist and industrial rather than beautiful or bucolic or wild, right? And these are very aesthetic kind of terms.
So then somehow this project also began to, or at least it has the potential to change the terms of the river and to change the way in which people experience it.
Exactly.
And people would have a sense, we know the river, we know what this is. But what Lauren has done through the well and what she's done, the way she's worked with it is to reveal a kind of reality and even a kind of life that people didn't know that was there.
Well, and the kind of fulcrum of that is that when they went to do the primary construction and lifted up the pavement, Lauren describes, and there's documentation of this, but I love it in her voice, of how she saw underneath that concrete, there was this crystal blue, aerated, lovely water flowing underneath the concrete, and something that she experienced as being intuitively, very vividly alive, kind of shocking to see this this different kind of water that's flowing under the concrete through the gravel. And she describes that moment as changing a lot for her, of her perception of the river and also her aims with the project. A lot of people in Los Angeles, and I think that Lauren also championed this kind of vision, want to see the concrete removed, which is a bit paradoxical because the concrete is also the only thing that allows the city to exist in its modern form. You can't remove the concrete if you want LA.
Maybe because of the danger of the floods.
I mean, increasingly, as storms are getting worse and worse with the warming climate, they worry that even this massive flood control infrastructure is inadequate, becoming inadequate, that one day there will be the big one that overflows the channel. But Lauren talks about how seeing that, or, what she reveals underneath complicates that picture. The concrete is not just this eyesore or this necessary evil or this industrial aesthetic. It might also be a kind of shield that is protecting this groundwater that is still flowing. There's this revelation of a kind of invisible river that is still moving under the concrete. And one thing that Lauren said in our long interview for this text is that you can't remove the concrete until you understand the epistemic meaning of what you're doing. What are you trying to liberate the river from? And so this is where her project, regardless of what is being done with the water, which is why I only get to that in the last kind of chapter of the text, regardless of what is being done with this water that's diverted, there's been an opening, that a kind of puncture that has been created in the physical infrastructure of the river, but more importantly, in the way that we perceive the river.
Perception. Mm-hmm. So tell me what it was like to go through and look at this with her, because when you went out there, you were obviously really interested in the project. You had some idea of the project, but your idea of it was necessarily limited, and you also, until you went out there, you knew you would have no idea how to write about it. So that the writing was determined by what you saw. So so since there is such a strong experiential element to the way you write and the way you believe this kind of art needs to be written about, what was it like for you? Describe a little bit going out there in the pickup truck, what you saw, and then what changed when you saw it.
Well, I mean, this project is a perfect test case for my phenomenological method, because I had never been to LA. And I liked that idea of having this very raw kind of outside impression of what I was going to discover. I was familiar with Lauren's work and Metabolic via some of their related projects, which revolve around basically unpaving concrete and watching what happens, letting soil regenerate in the presence of water and air and light.
Which is what goes on with this project too.
Yeah,
it's a part of it.
Very much related works. And because when they dug up the river, Lauren decided to kind of sculpturally install all the soil that was excavated in the digging of the mother well and the pipes, to install the soil in a warehouse under grow lights and light irrigation. And over the subsequent 2 years since that's happened, very quickly it began, that soil, which has been under pavement for decades, started to sprout with native seed that was still embedded in the soil. And it creates this stunning living sculpture. Stunning because, sure, it has this aesthetic impact, but also because it comes with this realization that soil is not dead, that there is the capacity for regeneration in the earth. And this appealed to me very much as someone who has a really innate love for something like tree roots busting through a sidewalk, or weeds coming up in a lawn. And I call this the aesthetics of regeneration. And I've done some writing up to this point to try and really take seriously the unique delight that I find in seeing the biosphere do its thing, especially as it resists human attempts to control it. And so, in large part, this essay is very much a continuation of that work, feeling that in Lauren Bond's practice and what Metabolic is doing, there is this aesthetic of regeneration is really at the center. And so, and I could tell, bending the river is also at the center all of that work.
So those seed beds, if that's what they are, the kind of soil that was collected from underneath the concrete, that they are now in the metabolic studio, and the concrete itself, a lot of these triangular slabs, enormous slabs of concrete were removed. And are those also in the studio? Where are they?
Yeah, they are. A lot of them are in the same space as the soil. And this is another interesting, aspect of, well, what is the work of art here for me? Because again, just as the artist is deciding, and very much as a sculptor, kind of deciding to keep the soil as these mounds, this kind of post-minimalist aesthetic, the same thing with these enormous shards of concrete that I remember someone at Metabolic telling me that the construction crew just thought they were absolutely crazy for wanting to keep the concrete in singular pieces. It just wouldn't be done. It's much easier to just jackhammer it all out. But Lauren insisted that they were going to be taken out in these sculptural pieces that would be kept.
Were they actually built in those slabs, or were those the slabs that they were cut in order to remove them?
Yeah, they were cut into those shapes, and then it was repaved after.
About how many are in the studio?
I feel like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly. I'm not really a precise numbers kind of person, but we'll get those counts. There's dozens.
But I just wonder, because I can have an immediate idea of that, and also the containers of earth as being something quite enormous.
The scale is enormous, yeah. And the pieces of concrete themselves, I kept thinking, it's like Tony Smith would just go weak in the knees over these things. Like, they have this gravitas of minimalist sculpture, but they are not really sculptures. The artist does not present them as sculptures. At most, they're these kind of indexes of a process. They signify a lot of things. The scale of that engineered river itself, because you see these small fragments of this huge paved infrastructure, and you realize how big that actually is. They also signify the tremendous cost and effort that's gone into the creation of bending the river. And they also refer to that story of what is underneath them. And the revelation that really is the heart of the project to me is what's going on underneath those slabs of concrete.
Well, they change the relation. I mean, any kind of assumption about the ways in which people thought about the concrete and the soil beneath them is completely undone. I mean, you take the concrete now has its own kind of life, and it's separated from the soil, and the soil on its own also has its own kind of life, and it is in fact a biological life because it keeps going. So in terms of the idea of regeneration, the placement of the stone, the cutting, is itself a different form of existence, and then the soil itself is life. And I'm curious, like, what's going to happen with these repositories of soil and the stone. I guess it sounds like for the moment they're just going to stay where they are, but I wonder if the soil is eventually going to be replanted or go back in the earth. What's the plan?
Yeah, well, you touch on an important kind of bigger point there, which is that I think kind of the medium that this work of art is engaging in, where, again, the concrete, the soil, these are a bit, they're like secondary media. They're helping the process, but the real medium that the work is engaging with is the living system. It is the living system that surrounds the river itself. And that's where, yes, this soil is a living entity that is being brought in for a time into the realm of this very sculptural presentation. But one thing that I admire about Lauren Bond's practice, and this is, the reason that metabolic has been built up as a sort of institution, is because this is necessary to engage in longer term kind of maintenance of things. And what I like about her practice as an ethos is that the energy remains in the system. One of the reasons I think Lauren Bond is interesting is also one of the reasons I think she's not as well known outside of LA as a contemporary artist, is because it's a very different model than the artist who's, putting on exhibitions and traveling the world and selling pieces, which is ultimately a rather colonial model of art. Lauren is somebody who, in the 30 plus years of her career, has just been digging deeper and deeper into the living system that has surrounded her work. This project, and this kind of answers your question about what will happen with the soil, Bending the River is almost like a second chapter to the project Not a Cornfield, which was a project where Lauren was growing corn on an abandoned rail field kind of adjacent to the studio property in order to try and remediate heavy metal poisoning and in the soil. Because corn, like many plants, can hyperaccumulate these substances. And even if you don't remove that corn from the site, the very fact that you're building biomass is lowering the concentration of those heavy metals. So one approach to bioremediation of soil is actually to leave the material there. The other approach is to take it away and incinerate it, right? To remove those materials from the system. But again, the ethos...
So no one was going to eat the corn?
No one was ever going to eat the corn. It would not have been a good idea to eat the corn. But yet, it was more than a symbolic gesture. It was not just growing corn as a symbol of, agriculture, or in the manner of Agnes Denes's wheat field, as this kind of symbolic image about land use or food systems, because the corn was actually performing this regenerative role, and then it was basically composted into the site. And so throughout the operation...
So once the toxins are removed and they go into the corn, even if they go back in as compost, they are not as toxic.
Yes, partially. It's partially that. I mean, certain, basically like petroleum pollutants can be metabolized by a lot of microorganisms and transformed into less volatile forms. And with they can't break down heavy metals, but again, just by building mass in the system, you are lowering the concentration of those things in the soil, if that makes sense. There's certain amounts of these things that are not considered harmful. You're building biomass that is not toxic. And it's also, I think there's a sort of honesty in that, right? In the same way that it's not ecological to let all the city's toxic runoff go out to sea and become somebody else's problem. It's also not necessarily helpful to try and remove industrial pollutants from this old rail site, because they have to go somewhere. And so the kind of ethos of the work is to try and keep them in the system and make something better out of that.
So you were talking about how Not a Cornfield led to Bending the River.
Very directly, because in trying to grow this corn, you need water to grow corn. And Lauren made the assumption, which is a very reasonable assumption, that she would just use the river water because the river runs right by the place, and found that it is illegal to use the river, which, becomes this kind of foundational absurdity that Bending the River is trying to address, of like, why can you not use a city water supply to perform land stewardship of that city? And to try and make an intervention in that.
So she had to find a way to get water, and that led her to
the project of bending the river. Yeah, we're realizing that also that the water, this issue of remediating soil, which is where she sort of started, is inseparable from the issue of water as well, in multiple ways.
So there are all sorts of continuities in her work. There, even the interesting way, I mean, in which one thing leads to another, and then it's almost like a aesthetic of emergence, because something is always emerging.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then the well gets built, and then the concrete gets taken out, the soil gets taken out. They get different lives. The river itself has a different life, and
it's tentacular.
Yeah, and we have a sense of some kind of process that will go on, and that will always be surprising, right? There's an unpredictability to it from beginning to end.
Right. And I mean, it's a process, an unpredictable process that, naturally, by definition, maybe will even exceed the artist's own lifetime. If you consider that soil and the piles to be part of the work, what is going to happen to it in the long term? We have some ideas about that, but if that remains part of the art, then, how long are you tracing that, right? And that's where it is important, where these more sculptural forms do emerge, in the slabs of concrete or the piles of soil, because it gives us something to really gather around and talk about. I think it's maybe a subtle distinction, but maybe it makes sense. My conviction that those things are not in themselves the work, but they give us something to formally grab onto and to respond to.
So how does so we've got the gesture and the fact of the well, and now we've got the metabolic studio, and we have the stones and we have the soil in there, and always there's a kind of need, and this will get to the critic's question of how what's going on actually becomes available to other people, and becomes a talking point where they can come in, they can see it, they can talk about it. Something else will happen, because that's part of this process as well. So how does that happen? I mean, how is the public brought in? How is it seen? How is all this seen?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of this project, the other kind of role of Metabolic Studio is to make all of that happen, to make the work more visible and available, as well as to maintain it. Metabolic is very different from studios of a similar size that, you find working for other artists. It is much more like a kind of living scaffolding that surrounds the work and also holds it up. And I think it's very interesting to structure an artist studio as a nonprofit. And because
is it like a big barn? Is it a series of offices? What does it look like?
There's a kind of compound of post-industrial structures, basically. An old Standard Oil warehouse and an old sweatshop factory and an old auto graveyard lot. So all very sites that have deep legacies, ties to industrial development and the kind of settler colonial history of LA, that are being converted and used as spaces for the work in extremely interesting ways. This Standard Oil warehouse being unpaved on the inside to do observational experiments on what happens to this soil that's been underneath polluted concrete for 100 years. And it's a very conscious adaptation of these structures. The same with the old auto lot, which they call the Moon, because of the kind of lunar desolation that it presented when the nonprofit acquired it. And they've since been unpaving it section by section and letting it kind of return to a floodplain ecosystem.
Yeah, you, you described as a you used the word laboratory at some point. And there's definitely a laboratory aspect in it. From the outside, it sounds pretty exciting because you've got all these things that come in, and then they can decide what they're gonna what they're gonna do with it. You know, completely dependent on what it is that they brought in, and I guess their discussions with one another, because there are 20 of them, right? Roughly 20 people at Metabolic Studio plus Lauren. But there's a real freedom, it seems, conceptual,
And a very
and
unique freedom as well. Yeah.
but this question of um, how it reaches the world, like how what because it's obviously important and it has the ability to affect other people, how people think about Los Angeles, you know, that part of Los Angeles, everything. So how does that happen, and where does the writer then fit in?
Right, because this is also, I see this as partly my job. I think in large part my job as a critic, or you know, the critic's job, to make a work like this accessible, because it is buried in different ways, both physically and in layers of, you know, social practice and all sorts of things, and it needs to be kind of narrated and excavated. And you know, Lauren Bond herself is probably the best narrator of the work. I have, you know, the kind of long form interview that I did with her as research for this piece is in itself a really wonderful archival document. But I also did not want to write something that felt like a profile of the artist. First of all, because I think that one of the things that I can do as a critic for any work of art, and particularly one like this that's can be difficult to draw boundaries around and articulate, is to present an outside view to the artist, to kind of take their work more seriously, or as seriously as anyone's ever going to take it, and let that work take me through curiosity and research and contemplation, and also take that work and dip it into my own currents of interest and research and see what it yields, you know, see what kind of meaning it generates. And I also think, particularly with ecological works of art, there's this necessary extension of authorship beyond the artist, which is part of why I'm interested in the topic. When you're working within living systems, you know, the kind of agency within the work is more than just the artist's intention, right? There is a lot of surprise involved, and there's a lot of other organisms involved, and you know, even this perhaps mystical living entity of the river itself might be doing its work on the project. And so I think that the writer has this quest to kind of narrate those relationships and to bring form to the work through a sort of storytelling.
How does this work? You started to talk a little bit about the ecological and the fact that part of what defines it is that is a way in which it holds the energy within the project itself. And I was wondering about what that means exactly, and then how that affects the writing, because as a writer, you're bringing the project, you know, the sort of inward looking aspect of it and the outward looking aspect, the private, maybe that's not the right word, and public, but how that works together. And there's also an aspect of this work, I think. There's both a great deal of ambition and a certain amount of modesty. So it's not self-promotional. And
in fact, it's self-obfuscating at times.
Right,
you know,
but I wonder, and that's so interesting in terms of the time we live in, where everything is self-promotional, and I think, and yet there's an idea there, you know, the humility. I mean, self-effacement. It's not quite the right word, but it's a different way of being in the world, and I'm wondering if you can talk to that, and also talk to your relationship as a writer to that.
I call that vanishing into the work when it comes to ecological art, where there's this sort of surrender to a greater temporality and a greater kind of authorship. Lauren Bohn is the creative visionary who is like the engine behind making this happen, but in perhaps a very feminist way as well, in a very post-colonial way. It's like I see the work as being much more about the river than it is about her. And there's this real attempt to listen and to get other people to listen to that voice rather than hers. Of course, at the same time, she's an artist that wields a pretty unique level of agency, and in terms of access to resources. She's a director of a major foundation, which, mostly funds metabolic studios. So there's a quiet sort of power and agency in that's implicit in what Lauren is doing. And the essay, works at making that explicit and dealing with that and not just ignoring it. But I think you don't have to be working at the scale that she is materially to maybe connect with this idea of vanishing into the work in an ecological sense. This essay has a sort of prequel in a text that I wrote in 2023, the same time that Lauren Bohn was digging for this, this primary part of the work, where I went to the site of an environmental artwork by Harriet Feigenbaum in rural Pennsylvania, where in a similar kind of ethos, the artist wanted to do an artwork that could help remediate an old coal pit mine, which had major amounts of chemical pollution down in this basin. And so she planted rings of willow trees there in the mid-1980s, early 1980s, as sort of a gesture towards regeneration of an ecosystem, as well as perhaps a memorial, kind of monumental gesture to point to the damage that was done to the earth there. And I went to visit this work 40 years later and found that the willow trees had helped facilitate this habitat for beavers at the site. There was an active beaver dam, and perhaps you're familiar with how beavers create wetlands in their activities. And it was such a fascinating case for me to see a work that, had happened many years ago and then was effectively abandoned, allegedly. And to find that not only is the original sort of intention or ethos of the work still ongoing, in the sense that there's a wetland ecosystem kind of slowly being generated here, but that is no longer due to the activity of the artist in a direct sense, even though that's what she wanted to happen. And it kind of blew my mind around both, the scale of time on which a work like this can play out, that it's like never really over. If you're talking about a living system, nothing is ever over. And the only thing that is going to characterize it forever is change. And also that this idea of authorship had opened up. And if the point of the artwork is to create an ecosystem, then that's going to take more than a human artist. And finally, there was this opportunity for me as the writer to come back into that system and declare it to be art once again. It had been the artist, through her activity, had designated that as a work of art. And then again, it had been sort of forgotten. But then in having the writer come in and write about it as art again, it becomes art. And also, has another potential to kind of grow its sphere of relationships, right? By maybe influencing people to either engage with that site or to just think of living systems or art differently.
So what would vanishing into to the work, if what would that actually mean? How would that work as a writer? How Yeah, I'm interested in the process of a kind of
Well, you mean for me as the writer to vanish into the work?
yeah, how as you kind of delivering yourself. I mean, maybe this gets back to a kind of aesthetic vocabulary that I'd hope we can talk about a little bit, that Lauren had set in motion a bit, that includes words like wonder and puncture, and maybe particularly the word attention.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and interested in how just how that works for you in the process of putting together a text, so that you're in a certain relationship to it that you really want to respect.
Right. I mean, it's about a kind of openness that means you can't show up kind of armed to the teeth as a critic with any sort of training to something. I think in the essay you find that I work in a way of almost negating various types of judgment from happening too soon. I actually generally, I think I'm an unusual art critic in the sense that I'm rather uninterested in directly asking the question of whether a work of art is good, because I think that's a question that always betrays assumptions about what makes a good work of art or what a work of art is. And part of what I mean around phenomenology is like delaying those systems of logic, those knowledges, those categories that we bring to things, and just trying to be very present and experiencing a work of art for whatever its meaning is, and knowing that that process of criticism actually makes that system of meaning possible, and also then makes it available to other artists and other critics to continue or expand a discourse around art or the making of art. So this piece does try and really introduce a set of terms, both related particularly to Lauren Bond's project and also more broadly around ecological art, that I hope can come out of this process of attention to this work, that I hope can continue as part of a discourse and conversation and inspire other people. And the idea of wonder is one that is very central to the text. Like a lot of the essay is kind of exploring wonder as an aesthetic affect, which is a very theoretical way of asking how wonder is relevant to art and to ethics and even perhaps what we perceive as beautiful. And that is a term that does come from Lauren Bond. I asked her what Bending the River does, what she wants to do as an artist. And she said she wants to activate a device of wonder. And I thought that seemed like a very significant point to really try and break down in the essay and theorize, what is a device of wonder and how does it work? And wonder is encapsulated in that moment, Lauren's story about opening up the concrete and seeing this living water flowing underneath it. I think, and I define wonder in this piece as essentially a perceptual event. It's this event where reality, particularly the reality of a living world, exceeds our expectations and exceeds the frameworks of knowledge that we bring to it to try and understand it. So it's this moment of opening to a new possibility. And the puncture is another term that I explore that also comes directly from the artist. I asked her, if Bending the River is a sculpture, then what are its what are its formal elements? What's its formal gesture? And she identified the puncture. So in my reading, the puncture is, which is also wrapped up in the unpavement projects more broadly, it's turning wonder as a perceptual event into a practice, into something that you can do to create that, to open up a living system to that new kind of feeling.
I mean, Lauren is clearly aware of this language. She's clearly aware that in this ecological, regenerative way of thinking about things, that a certain element of surprise and discovery is always there if you're available to it.
Right.
Or not always there, but discovery, recovery, these things that you can see if you're attentive enough. So it's a question almost of putting yourself in the state of mind where you can listen and be available and be receptive enough, and if you are, that something can really happen.
Right.
That's transformative with you in relation to the work, and it's set up that way. This is partly what I think, ecological imagination, how it would work. But I wonder if we could even be more specific then if we talk about wonder here, like where is it? How would it happen? What if she talks about a device of wonder, like what, in a way I could see where the cistern would be that, like the cut would be that, but
but the
can
challenge
we be more
is,
specific about what this experience would actually be, how it would manifest itself in relation to the work?
Right, because the challenge, as you're saying, with the idea of like witnessing the physical infrastructure of the mother well or whatever, might be a powerful aesthetic experience, but it's invisible, right? It's buried. It's not available to the optical gaze. But it can become visible through the storytelling and through the work of criticism as a form of storytelling. I do think that, as I talk about in the essay, Rachel Carson wrote a book on wonder, and it's largely about how we're most receptive to wonder as children, which I think we're all familiar with, and that makes sense that we're most kind of receptive to a pre-intellectual kind of openness to the world and a capacity for imagining the world as something alive when we're very young, and I think,
or seeing that it is alive, right?
And you don't have to be a child to experience that. And I think the goal of a device of wonder is to create that kind of powerful experience. How it does that is, because of the nature of the work, oftentimes non-optical. It needs to be experiential or narrative, even. And it can work in very subtle ways. Part of my interest in this, this idea of the puncture and the river as this invisible living entity, this actually reminds me a lot of the kind of concept and language around acupuncture, a kind of form of medicine based on the very small gesture that works on a subtle system of energies. And so, this device of wonder is not going to work on you mechanically in that same way. But as you say, Lauren is very sophisticated in her language around the project. And I think that is because she does understand that it operates epistemically. This device of wonder might operate primarily on how we feel like what we know. And what we don't know, and what is surprising us, and this idea of this device of wonder, or this experience of wonder, working narratively through narrative encounters with the work. Because yes, if you don't go to visit Metabolic Studio, which is, at the end of the day, I mean, it's on private property. There's lots of public engagement, but a lot of this work is hidden from, as most art is. A lot of work we experience through writing and through conversation and through images, and it can work on us in quite profound ways, even so. Like perhaps no one will be as transformed by the work epistemically or otherwise as Lauren Bond and the people around her, but we all live in relationship to rivers, whether we're aware of it and thinking about it or not. And to the extent that engaging with the work, however you engage with it, makes you think about that or live in deeper relationship to water, the more it's working. And so there's also a sort of range of impact that the work can have on you, right? But it's also where it's not just a sort of local interest, Los Angeles-based project. Because actually, I mean, something that Agnes Dennis said was that when people start thinking, they become part of your work. You know, when you can make people engage with something, then they're brought into it. So I think there's the way that the device of wonder works is epistemic, to put it in philosophical terms, and subtle, to put it in, you know, maybe more mystical terms. And there's varying degrees to which it might work on you, depending on how much attention you give the project.
But what would be a device? Like I'm just like instrumentalization of wonder. Instrumentalization's an odd word for me. You know, it almost can contradict the wonder, but I don't want to push too hard on that. But I just wonder what the device would be. And I also, like, it seems to me, once we talk about the soil that's underneath the concrete and that's been there for decades or maybe longer than that, and you pull it up, you put light on it, and it begins, the seeds are still alive, that as an idea of wonder, it's there. I mean, I don't even need to see it.
That is the device.
Once you write about it, you know. So in terms of the ability of this project to generate an experience of wonder, it's there in the writing as well.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that is wonder. Just
Mm-hmm.
like her experience of the crystal, you know, water
Mm-hmm.
suddenly showing up out of the blue, because it's all like unexpected.
Right.
It's life that's unexpected, and it appears, and it feels like there's something boundless, and
Right, which is a very important thing to be able to feel. You know, I mean, I think that a lot of what is going on culturally is a lot of dread and a lot of guilt and a lot of sense that you know, the biosphere is being destroyed, which, you know, it is, and we're all still actively complicit in that process. But it's where it is very medicinal, I have to say, to return to almost an acupuncture type metaphor, to be able to perceive that living systems regenerate themselves. It's what they do, not on timelines that we're always going to be comfortable with, you know, and certainly on scales of time that exceed a human lifespan, certainly scales of time that exceed an artist's career. But these powers of regeneration are innate in the world. And it's important to witness that, because then the second degree is realizing or deciding to engage with it directly, right? You know, to do something like what the artist and, you know, Metabolic Studio are doing, which is actually very, very gently helping to facilitate the conditions for this to occur, you know. And that's where there's this flip, actually. You know, I think that bending the river can seem very monumental. It can seem like a very, very large scale of an artistic gesture, as well as like a material gesture, and it is. But it's also very small. from the scale of the water that's being diverted from the river being such a tiny fraction of the annual flow, to the simplicity of the gesture of unpaving a parking space in a parking lot and then letting the living system do its thing while maintaining this attention that, art is an attention training enterprise, right? One way that we can think of art is, as the art object or site-specific project or performance or whatever. It's as this anchor to gather around, to feel with and think about the important things. And so there's actually, I think, quite an intimacy and a small-scale gesture that is very related to wonder. Carson talks about wonder as being this very intimate kind of aesthetic experience, right? And I devote a section of the text to comparing, contrasting wonder to the aesthetic of the sublime, which is one that's, about cowering before this massive, overwhelming kind of force. And sometimes I think about that in relation to this idea of climate change that gets thrown at us all day, every day, as this huge, overwhelming, global kind of phenomenon that all you can do is cower before and feel very helpless in front of. And wonder is the thing that actually makes us bend down and look closer, that can actually bend our attention towards something surprising, something that's alive.
Well, the soil there, to have an experience of the life that's always inside there, that wasn't extinguished, that's still going on. There is still, I mean, in terms of sublimity, like an awareness of something so much bigger than we are, but the awareness, the experience of it is an intimate one. Right. So there's not the distance that you identify with the sublime, but there's still always a sense of something much larger. But because the experience of it is an intimate one, it can be taken on in a more reverential way. It's part of you. It's bigger than you, but it's also part of you.
It's something you can internalize, something you can embody.
Right.
So it's a powerful experience to have, and in that sense, this idea of a device of wonder, I think, is totally, metaphorical rather than instrumental. That device could take any shape, as long as it produces. It's really about that affect that it's able to produce, however that's coming through.
Well, each of these, the experiences of wonder, they are kind of, wonder is an event too. It's something you feel there's an enormity to it, and once you experience it, you remember it.
Right.
And if it's framed in a certain way in relation to this ecological, the system thinking, it's something that's always attached then to some kind of relationship to the world, which is part of what, your commitment to it. It's never something completely out there. It's always something that can have some relation to, relation, in other words, important to you, to our everyday lives.
Yeah, definitely. It can be something lasting, and kind of inspiration, and one that can be conveyed in language. I mean, as a writer, all critics think a lot of what is the point of art criticism. What are we doing here? And again, I'm fairly resistant to the idea that as an art critic, I'm here to pass some kind of aesthetic judgment, to have a take. I'm fairly uninterested in that because, again, I'm more interested in being a sort of vehicle or medium for. I might even use a sort of a term from theology, which is the exegesis, which is to explain a sacred text by elaborating on it, by being in dialogue with it, because the whole point is you can't explain a wisdom by breaking it down. It doesn't work that way. You have to kind of talk in dialogue with something until somebody gets it, because you don't want to reduce the complexity or the depth of something. And that's how I relate to being a writer. It's not really so much about, is this good, or what are the criteria by which I'm judging this? It's like what kind of experience, what kind of affect can we get out of it?
Yeah, I'm with you. It's what does it have to offer?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's probably an excuse me, that some element of judgment, which is not important, but you'll be working on different projects, and what you've been working on with Feigenbaum too, and they're very substantial, and one can get involved in ecological projects that are simply more limited in what they have to offer. I mean, it seems that bending the river, what it has to offer is almost inexhaustible.
Right.
So that they're its own kind of criteria that will show up, but it's never something that you have to lean on. It will just.
That's why it seemed like the perfect case for this, longer form examination and essay, trying to develop a set of terms for ecological art that can be applied elsewhere. Because, much like the river that the work is about, or that the work serves, it is inexhaustible. I mean, it is vast, even when that's initially hidden, or the scope of that is not immediately apparent. So it's very much a work that could sustain such a involved kind of piece of art theory, right. Really. Yeah.
I want to get to the question of storytelling, but I am struck. I do have the feeling that, and I might be wrong, that these kinds of projects, they're still precarious in certain ways, and precarious in relation to writing. I know there's a very strong ethical element in the way you want to write about them, and the way you feel it's important to be true to the particular realities that you're working with. And which implies to me in a way that people can come after this material and write about in a certain ways that maybe could hurt them. And perhaps if they get caught up so much in a kind of self-promotional institutional system within a different kind of language, it could cause a certain amount of damage. And I might be overreacting to that, but I tend to feel like you do, that as someone writing about it, that it is something we need to. You're very careful about language. There are certain terms I don't think you would bring in. It's language that allows a certain kind of movement and openness always. I
spent a lot of time thinking about what you just expressed, because I think that I think it's very easy to read work like this as activist in its kind of essential nature. And I think so there's a lot of the text is devoted to this topic around how we need to be very careful about flattening art and activism into the same categorical activity. And this is discussed in the same chapter of the text as this idea of wonder, and how what the work is really supposed to do is to create this kind of experience that is capable of facilitating profound change in people, in society, at any scale you can imagine, really. But its purpose is not to create that change, because that would be asking quite a lot of art, and would, part of what's interesting about this project to me is that what Lauren Bond is doing and the amount of resources that she is able to command mean that she is already way out on a limb of feeling more like a nonprofit director than an artist a lot of the time. As we start to attribute activist purpose to an activity, it needs to become accountable in very specific ways. You need to do what you say you're going to do. and you need to document that, and you need to follow through on that, and the accountability gets more and more specific. So even it can seem rather utopian and fabulous to have this large privately funded studio, but it's also all of the documentation and ethics and accountability that go into running a nonprofit as well. And that does start to be something different than the practice of art, which I think, as we've been circling again and again, you don't really know, you can't know what a work of art is doing exactly. And you can't have such a fixed goal in mind about what it's for, because then that idea of mystery or surprise, which is so powerful, it won't manifest itself. The very project of installing the soil in the warehouse, scientific researchers couldn't even do this without extensive justification of exactly why and what are we going to study and what are we looking for. Within the less determined space of art, you get to just dump 3 tons of soil in a warehouse and see what happens. And that is also the source of, the power of the work.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I think part of the difficulty in writing about this kind of work for a long time, or social practice work, or community-based work, whatever the different terms, which I have written about, is there is a very strongly, it became very dutiful. Mm-hmm. And so if you write about a project that involves hydraulics and engineering and Native Americans and the history of the city, that somehow, in order to write effectively about it or justify, you have to pay attention to every aspect of it, and you have to be responsible to every aspect of it. And what you're saying is something quite different, and that there's that what the work has something to offer, to go for what it has to offer, and in relation to this language of wonder, attention, puncture, whatever, that there's something available there, and you can take it, and you can go with it, and it's sufficient in itself, which doesn't close off the possibility or even the need among various people to write about every aspect of the work, but you can't. And so there's a way of honing in or zeroing in on it, on the particular life that it has for you, that's really sufficient in itself, and really has a transformational kind of energy into it that is important to latch onto, and without feeling the obligation or the duty to deal with every aspect of it, which you can't.
Because you can't, and I mean, it's a very difficult process, because you do want to give attention to all. There are a lot of ethical and political issues always at play in any land-based art, because you're, getting into a greater politics and culture of land use there, and there's a lot to navigate, and there's a lot in the footnotes of this essay that, things where I had to decide where to draw the boundaries of the story, because you have to try and give attention to all of these things, but there's also, a text can't be everything. And when you're dealing with a work of art that is a living system, that is potentially infinitely extensible in the line that you draw around it, it is tricky to decide where to, how to map your story. And it's where you can't get bogged down in, maybe this brings us a bit to the kind of art historical frameworks that the essay is influenced by and engaging with, because if you're going to, in Mi-Wang Kwan's language, deal with the work as a discursive site, as a territory of ideas and topics and politics, you are going to get very overwhelmed, because it has many, many discursive layers of ethics and politics and culture and land use that you can't, it is going to get very complicated, and it's going to become very easy to attack the work for not having fully considered those things. And it's why in the text, and we can unpack this a bit, I propose how ecological art is different, because my nose is trained on the living system, the living system that is being activated and altered by the work, right? And that remains surrounded by a bigger discursive territory, a bigger world surrounds that. But my logic became to stick with the ecosystem that is actually being touched by the work.
Let's talk a little bit about the storytelling, and then I really want to hear your thoughts about criticism itself and being working as a freelance critic these last few years and where you're going from here. The idea of the storytelling, the idea of the storyteller, and the idea of how narrative works here. We've talked around, and we've probably said a fair amount about what the writing can do in order to bring out what's invisible, what's buried, to open up the possibility to create a perceptual field, to create a kind of contact between what's going on there and the person who's reading it. But the storytelling, it's a profound word, it's an important word, often an overused word, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about what this term means to you.
I think that all of our knowledge of the world is not only related through stories, but constructed through them. And I think that within a Western intellectual culture writ large, that fact has most often been diminished in its importance, even though it has always actually remained the case. I think that, these frameworks of Western science and Western cultural history that so much emphasis is placed upon, these are stories. They're also stories. It's always a process of taking perception and making it meaningful, making it legible, making it shareable. So I guess for some reason, I'm somebody who sort of thinks of the entire world in terms of stories. Being a writer, I guess it's not that surprising. And again, this is my kind of why I don't relate so much to the task of an art critic as, performing a critique, performing a critical judgment, because what I'm interested in art for is as these kind of boundary objects that are these sort of fulcrums of relationships. And there are infinite number of ways to tell a story around a work of art, and that's sort of the historiography of art history and art criticism, the different ways that you can understand a work of art is also related to the different kinds of ways we can tell stories and receive stories and the kinds of stories that we want to hear.
I guess it's a question I'm asking a little bit about, the content of stories, because when you bring in yourself and you talk about your own experience, sort of, with water in Northeast, Georgia. I think that's where you grew up. That's and a childhood there. In terms of storytelling, I understand that as storytelling. But is storytelling also the story of the cistern and how it's opened up? Is storytelling also the story of the soil and putting it in cases or whatever and watching it grow and interactions with it? I think of stories very much in relation to people interactions of people, histories that have passed on. So storytelling is a way, thinking of, Benjamin here of one thing and another thing, and then and the way things get transformed from over generations.
Right.
So what storytelling in relation to ecological work, regenerative art practice, it doesn't quite connect with that, although it could. So I'm wondering, like, how expansive or how limited your idea of storytelling
Well, I
is.
think it connects very directly to the idea of ecological art because, and you've just said it, this thing about how stories and meaning transform over time in their passing along and in their retelling. One of the reasons that I think of the whole world through stories is because I believe that knowledge itself is also alive and therefore ecological. It's always mutating, it's always changing. This is a characteristic of a living system, is that it is always changing. And, the great mysteries that we don't know why or to what end. And knowledge works the same way. And storytelling is a very honest way to describe knowledge in that regard, that it's not this fixed teleological thing, it's open to change. And in fact, you can't prevent it from changing. Even by telling a story twice, you've changed it somehow, And so I think it's very innate to an art criticism that's adequate to ecological art is to take seriously that framework of storytelling because of its epistemological kind of implications, as well as because it is through story in the way that you say that it's about people and places and events. This is also how we navigate ecological works of art, which take place in the real world and have these sort of ever-expanding plots and settings that we need to, you need to kind of quest into them and make them into stories.
I think you mentioned at a certain point that the storytelling in relation to the projects that you're involved with, it would be is essentially a supportive one, and I wonder, this would get into the question of critical distance, not necessarily the question of being there to pass judgment on something, but it is wondering where your freedom. I mean, you clearly at this point don't feel that there are any limits on your freedom in relation to this material, and I get that completely. But I wonder about a relationship to the projects that would necessarily be supportive, rather than where does your own critical intelligence come into play?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's definitely not a lot of critical distance for me the way that I'm working, and it's why I don't identify as an art historian. I think, I identify as an artist, and because of this idea of storytelling and the kind of living nature of the information or the knowledge that we're transmitting, I know and am interested in the fact that my storytelling about this work is part of the work. It's modifying it in ways that I am not in control of and not trying to manipulate. My responsibility is to be as rigorously accountable to what I perceive as I can. And, that comes with an implicit solidarity with the artist and her purpose. I only write about things because I perceive in them complexities that are worth exploring. So there's already an expression of solidarity in entering into this process, but I can't pretend that there's any objectivity or critical distance. And again, I actually am not interested in that when it comes to art criticism, because I think that idea of a critical distance or an objectivity is full of assumptions about, what art is supposed to be. When you're bringing a sort of art historical or cultural framework to something to evaluate it, there is no objectivity. you're already biased in, bringing your cultural training to the process of evaluating a work of art.
But I could see, let's say, if you were to write a book on metabolic studio or bending the river, which could happen. I think I'd like to see it. But I could see if you were around that work, you were around the studio for extensive periods of time, you would also see things that inevitably that you would have questions about, maybe even interpersonal.
You mean doubts about?
I don't know if anything necessarily that would give you doubts about the work, but again, on a level of detail, you might see things that you'd go back and you're a little bit troubled by that, or a little bit bothered by that, and then wondering how that would be brought in. But that's that's down the road, and because I think you're also after something very very broad. And living with these projects over a period of time, you would have a lot of questions, and those questions would come in, and you would deal with them as.
Right.
And I don't think it maybe necessarily would define itself in the realm of criticism, but there would be questions, and then.
Well, and then it does start to become more of an art historical work, right? Which is also important, and I do see this text is not over. In the same way that I assign that as a matter of criteria for the ecological artwork, and therefore for bending the river, that it's residual, that it's not done, it's ongoing. And I certainly hope to continue to follow the project and to, revise and expand the text. I mean, it comes up against I feel like the text wants to exist in more or less the form that it is now. So I guess I'm just saying I'm open to a sequel, because in 10 years, there's going to be a whole different story to tell. And there's a lot in the final part of the essay that gestures towards these very unresolved possibilities about what the work is going to become.
And some anxiety, even in Lauren, I think, like what part of the nature of a project like that, you take it on. It's not like, a sculpture where you can work on it a certain amount of time. You take it on, and then it becomes part of your life.
Yeah,
and then
it's not going to
and
end.
then it's there forever, and you might not want it to be.
That is very, I think, present for the artist. I think she's at a point in the project of realizing these things, that it is this, you've created something that, because you're dealing with an energetic system that can't be destroyed, it's going to continue.
And there's so many people involved in it, and
that has placed, ever greater kind of sense of responsibility and accountability, and like wanting to make the right choices on the artist about what is the next stage of this thing, what is its legacy going to be. And so it's why I leave it, for now, I think productively, rather open-ended.
And your writing plays a role in that, it's. So we just had a little bit of an exchange about your feelings about writing, about being a freelance writer now, and I there were certain thoughts that you wanted to put out there that I'm very interested in, and I feel like anything you're about to go to graduate school, so you're in the history of science, so something will change for you. But I feel you have very strong feelings about being a critic. You've expressed some of them very well, and so I wanted to give you a chance to say here, we're interested in writing, we're giving grants to writing on sculpture, and what your thoughts might be. Right.
This is a really important topic to talk about, I think, given the context that we're in. It's no mystery why it's very hard to be an art critic, as it's hard to be any kind of artist. And grant funding has been instrumental in whatever limited financial success I've had in my career as an art writer. I have been freelance for close to 10 years, and mostly that has involved working on projects for other people rather than being able to have funded opportunities to work on my own work. And the difficulty of sustaining that is familiar to every artist and writer who's going to watch this. And it was actually in 2022, I vowed to give up writing art criticism. I felt it wasn't sustainable, and nor I was also writing on this beat about art and ecology, which, believe it or not, was not in fashion at the time, and no one was taking my pitches. And so I was like, I'm not even getting any pitches accepted, and I'm not getting paid. This is just not working. I'm going to apply for the Warhol Foundation Art Writers Grant, and if I don't get it, I'm going to give up. And I proposed a project to that foundation to cover contemporary art and ecology, and I got the grant. So I had to dig my heels in at that point. And this grant as well came at an extremely pivotal time in my life when I was taking care of a dying family member, and in an extended period of necessary just caregiving and bereavement, in which I would not have been able to continue writing if it weren't for the support of the grant. And unfortunately, these opportunities like these grants are very few and far between for writers, certainly for art critics. And there should be more of these opportunities, because, I mean, there's fewer and fewer kind of staff writing jobs in the world, nor would I want one, because, again, I'm not trying to do that kind of work. As much as I love art journals and magazines and newspapers and things, and these are really important circulating literatures, they are very tied to institutional and capitalist cycles of time. And I have been definitely exhausted by the beat of writing art reviews on this, let's go. And it's been a pleasure to work on this longer time scale on this essay, which did play a role in convincing me, as much as I had been resistant to the idea for a long time, that maybe some time in academia would be good for me. So I am undertaking a PhD starting in the fall, which is also tied to this essay, because it diverges from art theory and art history into environmental history and environmental science over and over again. And that was a very inspiring process, or part of that narrative, right? The storytelling of the piece, to have an art critic that, in thinking about the LA River because of this artwork, is now studying environmental science. And if the device of wonder has this kind of range that it can affect you, I think I was affected very strongly by it, which maybe makes sense given how much attention I did give to the work. But it sort of has played a role in like guiding the course of my life. So yeah, it'll be a big change, and I have to admit that I'm looking forward to not freelancing, not being a freelance writer for a while.
Are you going to live at the school?
I'm going to stay here. I'm going to stay here. Yeah. I mean, as much as I might want to leave the game as an art critic, I can't imagine my life not surrounded by other artists and writers in this city.
Well, I can certainly imagine this kind of essay becoming a regular part of your life. And I can imagine, somewhere, this essay is around 12,000 words. I can imagine 12, 20, 30, given the time to be involved in particular projects where they become small books and they evolve on their own, and where you're able to do it. So I'm grateful for this conversation, and we believe in you, and very honored to have given you the grant. So Thank you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.